This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. This one's going to be a little bit more freewheeling today, and I'm going to be discussing a topic that I do not usually bring up on the show, and this is America's public education system. Now, as many of you know, I am a public school teacher, and I know that there are a lot of people that think that it's hypocritical for me to be a libertarian and to be a public school teacher. There are a lot of reasons why I haven't addressed this on the show, and the biggest reason for that is that I have to protect myself as a professional. I did go and get a college degree, 2 college degrees, in order to become a teacher, and I also am trying to make an impact and a difference within the public school system, and I'm trying to make the public school system more efficient. And I know that there are a lot of people that are out there that think, well, it all has to be abolished and that we just need to get rid of the public school systems, but that's a fantasy world because it's not going to happen immediately. And unless we start waking people up to the reality that these institutions are all corrupt and inefficient, then there's never going to be any change. So yeah, I could leave and find a job working somewhere else, but I would not have the impact that I can have within the system itself. And I know that that bothers a lot of libertarians, but that is just the reality of it. And one of the things that's really frustrating to me about that mentality from the libertarian perspective is that there are a lot of libertarians that want to say that we should not associate ourselves with any of these public sector institutions, but then they work for corporations that are a part of the S&P ESG index. For instance, the federal government and government in general is involved in every single aspect of American society. And so just because you work for a quote unquote private organization does not mean that you're not supporting the federal government. So I wanted to say that there. And I also want to say up front, because I know that there are some people that are listening to this who are probably nervous that I'm going to say some very specific things about certain individuals within the public education system, that you don't have to be nervous about that. I am a firm believer in confidentiality. And one of the reasons why I don't talk about this issue very often is because I don't want to expose anybody in particular, because I don't think that this is the right forum for that. And I don't think that this is the right platform to do that. So I'm not going to be talking about any specific individuals on this show today. And because I know that there might be some people that listen to this and try to use it against me, I want to make it very clear up front that I am only representing myself unless I am talking about experiences that other people have shared with me generally, in which case I am representing them. But the things that I say on this show do not represent my school or my school district, and I need to get that out of the way first, because there are people that are, I guess really the only way to put it is that there are people that are ignorant, and it should go without saying that if you're listening to my podcast, that everything that I say on this show only represents my point of view. But because we live in a world where everyone is a collectivist and where everybody believes that if you are a part of an organization, you say or do something that somehow reflects the values of the institution, I want to make it clear that I'm not speaking for anyone other than myself on this show. So if anyone wants to pull me in a meeting or anything and tell me that I am trying to represent either my school or my district, that's not at all what's happening. These are my views that I have developed over the last couple of years. Now, in March of 2020, I was a good old school classical liberal. I had been converted to libertarianism in 2016 by Gary Johnson. I know that a lot of people have problems with Gary Johnson, but for someone who had grown up in a world where we were not supposed to question the authority of government and where we believed that our public institutions were designed to serve us, I thought that Gary Johnson's message was very appealing because it didn't sound conspiratorial. It sounded very reasonable. It was simply a platform of wanting to limit the government, make the systems that we have more efficient, and also increase freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of those kinds of things to really create an open society, which as a Christian, I firmly believe in. I believe in absolute freedom, that people should be able to make their own choices, because I think that the church is in the best position when it can freely share the gospel with other people without the threat of force, and when it is not actively being oppressed by the state. So that message of kind of classical liberalism appealed to me. And so in March of 2020, I was just a good old school classical liberal. I still believed that there was a place for the government to build roads, and I still thought that there was a place for public education, and I still thought that there was a place for a minimum welfare state and, an overseas military presence. But I wanted all of those things to be done efficiently, and I wanted them to all be much smaller than they were. Well, it didn't take very long after March of 2020 for me to change my mind on all of those issues, because I saw during the COVID pandemic just how corrupt all of these institutions were. And being a public school teacher during the pandemic in the state of Kentucky, where our governor was one of the absolute worst COVID tyrants in the entire country, demonstrated to me that the public education system is not actually designed to serve our students. Shocker. I should have known better. But I started out my career a couple of years before that in inner city school, as I've said before on the show. And it was obvious, even from talking to the administrators at my school and the very few people that worked at central office, everybody knew that there were problems. And all of the legislation that guided and controlled education wasn't actually designed to serve the kids. Now, they weren't principled libertarians, so they didn't have the ability to address that economically and philosophically in the way that I can now, and that most of you that are listening to my show can now. But everyone, even in 2017 and 2018, realized that something was wrong with the public schools and that the institutions themselves were not there to support our students and to help create critical thinkers who can be successful in the dynamic economies of the 21st century, which should be the purpose of education. That's the goal of education. But I realized, as people at every level in the public school system, from the federal government to the state Department of Education to our own district, just straight up lied to families and students about the severity of the pandemic, about the necessity of the response, about the vaccinations, and they got every single policy wrong. Like during 2020, 2021, and in the state of Kentucky, we were masking kids into 2022, if you can believe that wild, making people stay at home for 5 days if they were in contact with someone that had COVID. Just insane policies that have all been demonstrated to be wrong and ineffective. All of those things were imposed upon all of us without any regard for whether or not our kids were going to get a high quality education and without any regard for the families of our students. And so for me, being on the inside of a public institution during the pandemic completely shaped and reframed my perspective on government and on the role of government, because I realized that these institutions have a ton of money and a ton of power, and they're only going to use them to benefit themselves. Now, with that being said, I still believe that ultimately the public school system has to be abolished. I mean, I'm an anarchist now. I believe that every single public institution should be made private. I think that a lot of these educational decisions could be much more flexibly made and much more efficient if they were opened up to individuals. And public education is very expensive. I think it cost the taxpayers of Kentucky an average of $14,000 per student in the state of Kentucky for them to receive a public education, whereas I have friends that send their kids to private school, and yes, they're paying $6,000 or $7,000 a year per kid to send their kids to private school, but that's like half the cost of what the taxpayers of the state of Kentucky have to pay in order to send a single student to public school. Students that don't often want to be there and that don't often want to learn, and that graduate at the age of 18 without actually having an education. They don't know anything about the world when they graduate high school. And so, yes, I want to say that for all of my libertarian listeners, I'm with you. Okay, but just because we know as libertarians that privatizing this system would be more equitable and just and efficient, and it would provide for the needs of a very dynamic and diverse population much more effectively than a one-size-fits-all public education system that's completely controlled by bureaucrats and politicians, I understand that. It's not going to go away just because we want to watch it disappear. And I think that in the meantime, it's incumbent upon us to do whatever we can to reform the public education system. And so if I'm in the system and I have a shot at making it more efficient, and if I have a shot at limiting the size of the public school institution. And if I have a chance to help the bureaucrats and the politicians that spend this money use that money more effectively, to actually pour that money into our students and the teachers and administrators that are in the building with the students every day, instead of giving millions and millions of dollars a year to bureaucrats at the district and state level that do absolutely nothing to provide our students with a better education. And in fact, a lot of the times they're an impediment to our students getting an education, then I'm going to fight for that. And I think that that's an important fight to take on in the meantime. I don't live in a libertarian fantasy land. I live in the real world. And again, my worldview has been completely shaped by my experiences in the public school system. But I say all of that to make the point that it is so obvious when you are on the inside of this system to realize that the kids that attend our schools and their families are the last people that are considered when it comes to the way that money is spent on public education. And we all know that there are a lot of institutional problems in the public schools. We also know that it's very difficult to discipline kids. So we are sending kids to schools that are not because of principals and teachers. And that's the way that a lot of libertarians wrongly portray it. A lot of libertarians blame the problems in our education system on school principals and teachers because you hear these sensational stories in the news. And if you watch Fox News, they have all these crazy radical teachers from California or Illinois or whatever on there in their silly outfits trying to indoctrinate kids into whatever kind of issue it is. Okay, that's not what happens. By and large, those are outliers, and those are, I think, purposely presented by the media in order to generate controversy so that these media outlets can make money. But that's not what's actually happening. The vast majority of teachers and the vast majority of principals, like the principals and administrators that are in the school, not district bureaucrats, most of them are completely disconnected and insulated from reality. And there's a reason why they work at the district central office and not in the public schools. And the biggest reason for that is that a lot of them are not successful in the classroom and don't want to be successful in the classroom. That's why they work there. And they're just a parasite. They're parasites. They're a drain on the taxpayers, and they place unnecessary burdens on teachers. But the majority of teachers and administrators really do care about our students. Like, we really do want our students to get a good education. And again, I think that there are some people that I work with, and I'm not going to speak for everybody, but I think that there are a couple of people that, because of my relationship with them, have been pushed closer and closer to libertarian ideals. But even the ones that aren't, and you got to understand, I'm a teacher in Kentucky, so a lot of my friends, even if they like vote Democrat, like a lot of my teacher friends, even if they vote Democrat and they consider themselves kind of liberal, they're like old school, like Ronald Reagan type Democrats, right? They're not like radical progressives. They might vote for Democrats and they might not like Republicans because the media tells them not to like Republicans, but they're not radical. And they're very conservative in terms of their values and their social customs. I think that it's very important to distinguish that, because most of the people that are portrayed in the education system at the national level by the national media are not like that. And in Kentucky, it's different. Okay. But even the coworkers that I have that are not like libertarians or like real constitutional limited government conservatives understand that something is wrong with our public school systems. We don't discipline our kids. We waste a ton of money. We don't care about actually providing for the academic needs of our students. And we know that the entire system is sick. They just don't have the language to express that. And that's why I try to push the conversation in a more libertarian direction. Because again, libertarians have the philosophy to understand, and not only the philosophy, but the language to explain why the public school systems are operating so inefficiently. But there could be changes that would be made that would make public education much cheaper and much more effective. And a lot of that is taking the control of academic decisions out of the hands of the federal government. You have to abolish the Department of Education. I mean, there are a lot of people within the public school systems that are against the federal Department of Education because essentially they've rigged the game to where you get a lot of money if your kids do really well on math and language arts. And if you don't want the federal government coming in and interfering in your state's education system, then you have to make sure that kids perform well on math and language arts common assessments at the end of the school year. And so the entire academic world is geared towards meeting those benchmarks that have nothing to do with giving kids a holistic education. Most people realize that that is a massive problem in our education system. We all see it from the inside. And so there are a lot of people that want to get rid of the Department of Education or at least curb their influence, but you have to get rid of the Department of Education. And I think that funding for schools would be much more effectively distributed if they came from the state. That would not be the optimal level, but it would be much more effective than if it came from the federal government. But I think really if funding and academic decision-making came from local levels, like local school districts made decisions about funding for schools, about the curriculum, about what was going to be taught there, that alone would make the school systems much more effective. And I also think that if we stop wasting money building giant buildings and initiating all these programs and new curriculum plans that don't actually benefit kids and that don't actually help them learn, then we could save a lot of money, and we should actually be investing this money into the local schools, the local teachers, the local administrators, and most importantly, the students and their families. That's how we can make this system a lot more efficient and a lot more corrupt. And the reality is we should not have a one-size-fits-all model for public education in the United States, because even within the state of Kentucky, even within my own county, okay, so I'm in Kenton County, Kentucky, and the way that it's divided is that like half of our county is rural. Like we have kids that are like living in hollers or that work on farms, or not work, but that live on farms. I mean, half of the county is very rural, and then I would say maybe 25% of the county is suburban, and then the northern part of the county, which is actually a separate school district, the one that I started in, is completely urban. It's right on the Ohio River, and so there's a small city there, and it's just a completely different world. So even within my own county, in the state of Kentucky, the needs of the students that are in the city and the northern part of my county are a lot different than the needs of the students that are in the school where I teach, where we draw a lot of kids from, kind of the outside of the suburban area, and then we draw a lot of the farm and country kids as well. Like their academic needs are different, their prospects for future work are different, and so I think that we should be able to gear instruction and curriculum towards the needs of those students and making sure that they can be successful in their respective economies instead of imposing a one-size-fits-all model of education on all kids everywhere. This is going to lead me to the point that I want to make today, and that is that our public school systems are not actually designed to address the needs of our students. They are designed to impose conformity and indoctrinate our kids. This is not just a left-wing phenomenon either. I know that left-wingers love the public schools, but right-wingers do too. Look at what Ron DeSantis has done in the state of Florida. He has deliberately signed into law legislation that makes public schools more conservative. And so if you live in a conservative state, public schools are oftentimes staging grounds for inculcating conservative values. And if you live in a progressive state, public schools are often staging grounds for inculcating progressive values. And that's not fair to our kids. And none of that has anything to do with giving them like critical thinking skills and a well-rounded education and like an ability to understand what's going on in the world around them when they become 18. I mean, the watchword in public education today is we want to make kids career and college ready. And I'm telling you on the inside, there's nothing about the way that we do public schools today that are making any of our kids ready for a job or to go to college. None of it is. None of it is at all. And everyone can see that. Like it's so obvious. And so many people are like, yeah, this doesn't make sense. But we do it anyways. I don't know. The point that I want to make is that public schools are designed to indoctrinate children, and this shouldn't be the purpose of an education. The purpose of an education, at least in the classical sense of the term, should be to give students the tools and the resources and the information that they need to make wise, critical decisions as adults in the real world, to become critical thinkers that are hard workers and that have the ability to successfully make a living for themselves when they graduate high school. But it's very difficult to look at the students that make it to high school and say that most of them have an education when they leave, because they don't. I mean, just look at American society. Obviously, we've had a public school system in the United States for a long, long time, and it just seems that we're becoming dumber as a civilization. We all know that. We all know that that's true. Where's the public school system been during this time? Trying to indoctrinate kids. That's where it's been. So there was a really great article on the Mises Institute a couple of weeks ago called Government Schools Are Propaganda Machines, and it's written by a guy named Karl Streitel. It was published halfway through February, 2024. And I wanted to read through this article and comment on this article because I do think that he makes a lot of really excellent points in here. And I do think that we have to understand that if we want these public schools that aren't going to go away, they're not going to disappear. So we have to stop pretending that we can just snap our fingers and they're going to disappear overnight, because they are not. But if we want to make our public schools more effective, and if we want to develop critical thinking skills in students, and if we want them to have the mentality and the worldview that they need to succeed in a complex environment, a global economy, then we can make positive changes to the public school system that will make it better in the meantime. And I think if we made some of those changes as libertarians, if we showed people that by reducing the size and power of the public school bureaucracy in the United States, that our students are actually learning more, that would probably lead more more and more people that would never abandon the public schools to say, you know what, maybe there should be other options. Maybe we shouldn't be funding for this. Maybe my property taxes shouldn't be so high. I think that this is an absolutely essential step towards realizing the dream of having an education system that's actually free to address the needs of the parents and our students. It's got to happen. This article does a great job of highlighting some of the most important aspects of this problem, and I'm going to read through it on the show today and just comment on some of the things that this author presents in the article. So it's called Public Schools Are Designed to Indoctrinate Children. I know that I've had a 20-minute lead up to reading this article, but I want you guys to be able to hear what it is that I think about what I do on a daily basis. I actually am kind of shocked that more people in the libertarian world don't ask me about my experience as a public school teacher, but I know that for a lot of people, education is not like a primary issue that libertarians think about, but it is really important, and I do have a lot of thoughts on that. And so, if anyone ever wants to have me on their show to talk about my experience, I'd be more than happy to do so. But let's go ahead and get into this article. So again, the title of the article that we're going to be taking a look at today, which is published on the Mises Wire a couple of weeks back, is Government Schools or Propaganda Machines, and the author is Karl Streitel. And he says he's talking about the benefits of homeschooling, and he is pushing back against the argument that homeschooling is essentially a version of right-wing propagandizing of children. So he says this. He says, in Artist Shepard's recent article, which I highly recommend, he aptly detailed the numerous benefits of homeschooling and data showing that homeschooled students, far from being socially stunted, academically insular young people are actually generally high-achieving, socially adroit young adults ready to provide value in the world. Thus, in this commentary, I want to address a common argument against homeschooling, namely that homeschooling is a breeding ground for propaganda, mainly far-right political and religious ideologies from parents and religious institutions, which is dangerous for social cohesion and democracy. So he sets up what he is going to be discussing in the rest of his article. And I have to say up front that public schools are, by definition, propaganda machines. They have to be. Think about it. Our kids stand up every single morning and put their hands over their heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the episode, but that alone inculcates our students into thinking about the legitimacy of the American government. That is a form of propaganda. And the way that we teach history, whether you're in a progressive school in California, New York, or Illinois, or you're in a more conservative school like Kentucky or Texas or Tennessee, the way in which we read history is a reflection of the values of the politicians. We don't teach history in all of its complexity and diversity and all of its complications. We instead teach a predetermined course of history. Either the entire American regime and everything that came before it is completely racist, sexist, homophobic, bigoted, or the United States is God's instantiation of the kingdom here on earth, which is what you get in a lot of right-wing schools. So by its very definition, public schools, which are political organizations, have propaganda. And of course, the bigger set of propaganda that our kids get from the public schools is the idea of the legitimacy of government. You're not going to have very many people in public schools challenging the idea that we need to have a government at all, or that we need to have a government that looks like the governments that we have today. And in fact, built into our state standards in Kentucky is the idea that we should be teaching students about the values of democracy. So even that is a form of propaganda, because it's not apparently or immediately obvious to me and other people that are within my libertarian camp that democracy is the optimal or even a beneficial form of government. And you're never going to be able to teach your kids that in the public schools. So again, just from the outset, it's really important to remember that within these public schools, their entire curriculum is built around propagandizing kids. Even if we don't call it propaganda, even if it's acceptable propaganda, mainstream propaganda, it's still propaganda nonetheless. So the author of this article goes on. The propaganda problem. To begin, there's a dearth of evidence to show widespread inculcation of homeschooled students with so-called radical political or religious ideologies. The media often provide anecdotes that are supposed to represent a larger reality, but in fact, a National Center for Education Statistics survey from 2019 showed that a desire to provide religious instruction was only the fifth most popular reason for homeschooling, chosen by 58.9% of parents, whereas the most popular reason to be homeschooled was concern about school environment, such as safety, drugs, or negative peer pressure, chosen by 80.3% of parents who could choose more than one reason in this survey. Every single one of those parents that take their kids out of public schools for those reasons is completely correct. There are plenty of drugs in our school. Our kids are not really safe because we don't have mechanisms to discipline or remove dangerous students from the classroom. And it's very easy to give in to negative peer pressure by other students. So that concern is completely legitimate. And I think that it's very interesting that many people choose to homeschool their kids, not because of religious reasons, which many do, and that's fine too. Again, this is a Christian podcast. Like, if you want to send your kid to a religious school or homeschool them so that they can receive religious instruction at home, you should absolutely be able to do that, because parents are primarily responsible for the education and the worldview formation of their kids. I think that's great. You should definitely be able to do that. But the fact that 80.3% of parents chose environment, drugs, negative peer pressure as the reason for withdrawing their kids is both completely accurate and indicative of the many problems that are plaguing our public schools. Okay, he goes on. Does such a reason strike you as ideologically or religiously radical? I would be much more judgmental of parents who are not concerned about their children's school environment. However, I concede it is undeniably true that homeschooled students, like any students or human beings for that matter, can be propagandized by any type of ideology, right, left, center, or otherwise. I know of no person or teaching materials that are truly unbiased, because to be so would entail having no opinions and providing all available information on a subject without explanation. So every teacher, parent, textbook, online course, or forum post is by nature biased in some way. Of course, this fact also means that government schools or private school students are also susceptible to and recipients of propaganda daily. Hitting the nail on the head there with that point right there. He's absolutely correct. And this is one of the reasons why I am a proponent of epistemological postmodernism, because the fundamental tenet of epistemological postmodernism is that all of our knowledge is subjective as human beings. We cannot completely overcome our biases, step outside of our cultural and social context, and just neutrally and objectively observe the world. That's not a possibility. And one of the reasons why people should receive a well-rounded education is so that when they become adults, they won't become these kind of objective thinkers. Rather, they will become less subjective, and they'll learn to critically analyze all of the information that they are faced with. So great point there. And that's something that public schooling cannot fix. That's just a fact of the limitations of the human intellect. He continues, moreover, such propaganda is inculcated far more effectively and efficiently via government schools that continue to churn out obedient and often intellectually incurious citizens who rarely question the morality or composition of the state that rules over them. Amen. This assertion should be self-evident through obedience to mask mandates, pledges of allegiance to flags, continued support for America's overseas defense campaigns, and the strong contention among many citizens that democracy and voting are salubrious for all. Very, very well put. He goes on, regarding this efficiency and effectiveness, let us think numerically for a moment. The plurality, 23.9% of school districts in the United States in 2020 to 2021 enrolled between 1,000 and 2,499 students, with an average per school enrollment of 555 students. The total public school enrollment was roughly 49 million in 2023 versus 3.1 million homeschooled students. About 5.5 million students attended private schools. Thus, approximately 85% of school-age children attended public schools last year. At the same time, the average number of children per family in the United States is 1.94. Therefore, the reach of a homeschool parent's propaganda is severely limited compared to that of the government. A public school reaches on average 555 students, while a parent reaches on average 2. Further, we know that students in government schools are receiving information that is vetted and approved by that very government via local school boards, and in many cases, too, I'm adding this, but in many cases, they're following state and federal guidelines as well. So students in such schools are undeniably being propagandized to think in a certain uniform way. No such uniformity exists or should be expected among millions of diverse homeschoolers whose school experiences will vary widely, thus impeding the spread of any single ideology, unlike in government schools. Again, what he's referring to here is the marketplace of ideas, that you have a true diversity of thought, and you allow children to be raised in a diverse manner of ways, and then when they become adults, they can compete in the marketplace of ideas. What a crazy idea. The effectiveness of this unitary government school propaganda, furthermore, is undeniable. One primary piece of evidence for the success of government schools in this regard is the fact that most parents still send their children to government schools and never think twice about the coercive way these schools are funded, while simultaneously teaching their children that stealing is wrong, taxation is theft. Despite the rapid growth in homeschooling since the COVID lockdowns, government schools still enroll the vast majority of students, as I detailed above, and parents still generally approve of their local schools. Government schools also earn an A+ for keeping people ignorant or misinformed, especially about history, government, and economics. Indeed, only half of Americans surveyed in 2008 can name the three branches of government, and only 18% and 23% of 8th graders were proficient in U.S. history and civics, respectively, according to the 2014 National Assessment of Education Progress report. Okay, the NAEP. Now, I do want to add a comment to this here too. It's not that what he's saying is wrong, but there's a reason for that. If you were to, and I teach 7th grade social studies, which is the global Middle Ages, and the textbook that we use is fantastic. It's a very middle of the road textbook. If a student read and internalized the entire textbook, which we do read the whole thing in my class throughout the course of the school year. But if a student read and internalized the entire textbook, they would have a very well-rounded knowledge of global medieval history. It does a very good job of accurately and unbiasedly, and again, there's no such thing as unbiased. It does a very good job of accurately and without being partisan, presenting an understanding of history that is more complex than what you might get in other states. So I like the curriculum that we use in my classroom. The problem with social studies instruction is that ever since No Child Left Behind in 2001 or 2002, whenever the Bush administration passed that into law, the Bush administration determined that its report card for success in state schools was going to be based entirely upon math and language arts scores. So you have to take a common assessment at the end of the school year, and whether or not the federal government was going to intervene or give funding or a certain amount of funding or allocate funding to your state depended on how well students performed on math and language arts common assessments at the end of every school year. So what has happened in American public education since No Child Left Behind is that a massive amount of time, money, and resources has gone into teaching kids math and language arts instruction at the deliberate expense of social studies and science programs. So, for instance, in the elementary schools, the students spend the vast majority of their day learning math and language arts skills, and sometimes they don't even get to social studies or science instruction, which is wild, but I'm telling you, it's true. We get kids in 7th grade that literally don't know the difference between a state, a country, and a continent. 7th grade. They've been in school for 8 years, and they don't know that. But it's not really their fault because a lot of elementary schools don't teach this. And it's not even really the elementary school administrators or teachers' faults either. They are having to comply with dictates from the federal, state, and then local education bureaucracies that tell them that they have to perform well on these standardized math and language arts tests at the end of the year. Now, a lot of people would say language arts is fundamental to every other discipline in school, so why not spend more time teaching kids language arts? But the way that it's taught in school from kindergarten on has nothing to do with giving kids the ability to read and critically analyze text. Instead, it's all designed to help students perform well on these end-of-year common assessments. So it's not like we're teaching kids practical math and language arts skills. Like, we're not teaching them how to become good readers for the sake of them being good readers that can think critically through a text. Instead, we're giving them the skills that they need to succeed specifically on the end of year state common assessments. And in a lot of ways, we're expected in social studies class to reinforce those language arts skills. So instead of just teaching kids history like we should be, teaching them civics, teaching them economics, teaching them political theory, the kinds of things that social studies teachers should be doing in school, we are expected by the state to teach them language arts skills so that they can perform well on that common assessment at the end of every year. Now, I don't know how much I can say on the show here. Let me put it like this. When I'm in my classroom in front of my kids, we teach history, we teach civics, we teach economics, we teach politics. That's what we do in class. And they're all based on our state standards. But I do not cave to the idea that all of my instruction has to be based around my students performing well on the language arts portion of the common assessment. Now, I leave my political biases out of my classroom because I don't believe I need to bring them in when we have state standards that are very middle of the line. My job is to teach my kids history, and I'm trying to help them become critical thinkers of history so that when they grow up, they can make better decisions about history on their own. So in my classroom, I'm not teaching them language arts skills every single day. Instead, I'm teaching them how to think historically, which is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, and we'll let the chips fall where they may on the end of the year state common assessment. So my students do pretty well. So I'm proud of the work that I'm doing in my classroom. We'll put it that way. So he goes on after this. I wanted to put that out there because it's really important that people understand exactly why social studies instruction is being marginalized. A lot of it, yes, is political and ideological, and there are plenty of bureaucrats and politicians that want to use social studies instruction to indoctrinate kids into a certain way of thinking about politics and religion and history and all of those kinds of things. That's a big part of the problem, but the biggest part of the problem are chasing the federal math and language arts benchmarks. That's it. The entire public school system is designed to help kids perform well on those tests, not give them a well-rounded education. So that's something that everyone needs to know. He goes on. How many of those students also believe Pearl Harbor was an unprompted sneak attack, that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, that capitalism caused the Great Depression, or that Abraham Lincoln took the country to war because of slavery? Is such misinformation not also propaganda that tens of millions of students imbibe each year? Consider also the mindlessness of pledging allegiance to the flag each morning, a pledge written by a socialist who is concerned about every alien immigrant or of inferior race eroding American values. Ironically, the under God section of the pledge was added to differentiate America from godless communism. When the state mentions God, no worries. It's apparently only those religious people in flyover countries who are the problem. Again, this is another point. Every single morning, it's really, really quite wild. And for a long time, I, as a Christian, have refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance or to sing the national anthem. Not that I ever sing anything in public at all anyways. Even when I go to church, I don't sing out loud. This is not who I am. But I don't sing the national anthem or mouth the national anthem or put my hand over my heart during the national anthem. And the reason why I don't do that as a Christian is because I believe that Jesus is the king, and I believe that my allegiance belongs to him and him alone. I'm not going to pledge allegiance to a country. I'm certainly not going to pledge allegiance to my flag, because in the end, again, read the book of Revelation. In the end, the only thing that remains is the kingdom of God and the new heavens and the new earth. The American empire will one day fade away. I'm not pledging my allegiance to that as a Christian. That is idolatry. It's blasphemy. Now, I know that there might be some people that are listening to this for whom that statement is a shock, and that's okay. You know, God gives grace to all people. We all have to learn and grow and develop. So if you still say the Pledge of Allegiance or sing the national anthem and you're a Christian, I just want you to think about what it is that you are saying and whether or not those words are in conflict with your larger theological beliefs. I think they absolutely are. But if you think about the fact that we force millions of American children to say the Pledge of Allegiance every single morning at school, I just don't think that we can sustain that more. I don't think we can make a good argument for that. And we're worried about teaching kids. We're so worried about making sure that we don't bring our social and theological and political biases into the classroom, which good, that's fine. I think the classroom should be a neutral space, or as neutral as possible, so that we can more rationally and more less subjectively evaluate the standards that are being taught in the classroom. But how is the Pledge of Allegiance not a religious statement? Like, how is putting your hand over your heart and saying that you pledge allegiance to the flag not a theological assertion? How is that not a statement of dogma or doctrine? How is it not a creed? I think it is. And I don't think that we should force kids to say that in school. Now, technically, kids aren't forced to say that. And I remind my students of that all the time, that they should only say the Pledge of Allegiance if they really mean it. If they don't really mean it, then they shouldn't say it. And they absolutely have the First Amendment right not to say it. But it's just so wild that would even be a part of our daily ritual in the school, especially if you're a Christian. It is idolatry to say the Pledge of Allegiance because we believe that Jesus is king. Very important to keep that in mind. He goes on. Finally, the government school system was established specifically to propagandize students and to encourage obedience to Protestant ways, it's true, and uniform thinking, i.e. not diversity and inclusion. Thus, although government school leaders may trumpet the diversity of melanin or gender, true diversity of thought, is not to be abided. This type of diversity is one in which government schools actively do not participate because it is antithetical to their mission and organization and dangerous to their propagation. Homeschoolers, on the other hand, will learn different ideas, perspectives, and information and will display a panoply of thought simply because they are not part of a centralized, bureaucratic, one-size-fits-none system. Now, I'm not as I know that there are going to be students that are homeschooled, because I met some of these people that don't get a good education at home, but they're also not getting a good education in the public schools too. So even if they're not getting a good education at home, at least there's more of a market within homeschool than there is within public schools. He goes on, you and I may disagree with some of these ideas, but it is simply irrational to say that homeschoolers from desperate families in different areas of the country learning diverse ideas from varied curricula will somehow be uniformly propagandized at any rate, even close to that of government school students. Don't believe me? If you went to a government school, just compare your experiences and what you learned in school to those of a friend or family member from out of state. How much learning diversity do you find on key issues? As the old saying goes, if everyone is thinking the same thing, then someone isn't thinking. The other point that I want to add to that, and this is something that I've been aware of for a long time, but if you go back to Horace Mann and John Dewey and some of the earliest public education advocates in the United States, their model of the public school was based on the Prussian model of education that was implemented by Otto von Bismarck, the first chancellor of a united Germany. And one of the reasons why Otto von Bismarck wanted public education is because the many German states that were very tenuously brought together under his rule had very different religious and culture, and in some instances, not in all instances, but in some instances, cultural backgrounds. So the idea behind having a public education system within the First German Reich was that all of these people from these disparate states would receive the same education, and this would lead to national unity. The idea being that if everyone receives the same state-sponsored curriculum that also approved of legitimacy of the German state, then everyone would believe in the vision of the United Germany that Otto von Bismarck had forged and spent his entire political career trying to forge. And it was that model of wanting to unify a diverse people with state-sponsored propaganda in schools that was adopted in the United States to induce conformity among all of the children that were in America's public education system. And since the establishment of the Federal Department of Education in the late 70s and No Child Left Behind in the early 2000s, that vision has only come more clearly into focus. So it's very important to remember that baked into the cake from the very beginning, the very foundation of the public education system in the United States was based on the idea that if we want to unify people and that if we want to instill in people one mind with one set of ideas and one set of political and cultural values, then we have to do that through the public education system. So by its very nature, the public education system is designed to propagandize kids into believing in the legitimacy of the state. He's almost done. He says, we also should consider that according to Gallup polls and others, religious conviction in the United States is shrinking, not growing. In fact, according to Gallup data between 2000 and 2022, the percentage of Americans who said religion was not very important to them rose from 12% to 28%. Unfortunately, Gallup does not ask Americans a similar question about government, i.e. if government is important in their lives, but they do ask if people think government has too much power. A majority does think so. However, a majority also thinks that government should have a greater role in 7 of its functions out of 11 provided. Such logic and morally inconsistent responses demonstrate what we might expect after 12 years of government propaganda. People will complain about government, but in the end, they support and often want it to do even more, especially if that more benefits their chosen groups. Thus, we find ourselves in a time of decreasing religious faith, but static or even increasing belief in the government's role in society. Despite complaints to the contrary, we also find ourselves in a time in which over 85% of children attend government schools to learn about the important roles of government in society and the morality and necessity of democracy. Whose propaganda should we really fear? As an antidote of the power of the current system's propaganda, I offer an example from my time as a high school teacher. In response to an article we read in class, a sophomore wrote the following, which I paraphrase: Nazis killed to kill, Americans kill to protect. Also, our government is completely different in political views and doesn't lie to us like the Nazis did. Lastly, Hitler was a dictator, which we don't have or support in America. Are such beliefs any less propagandistic than whatever a homeschooler might learn? Are such beliefs more or less easily transmitted to large groups of people in the government school system versus at home? If we are being intellectually honest, we know the answers to those test questions. man, I really thought that he did a great job hitting some of those key concepts here. And again, I'm glad that this article gave me an opportunity to talk about what I think is a very important issue, and an issue that dominates a lot of my own personal thought, because it has dominated much of my life since this is my profession, and I intend to be doing this for at least a little bit longer. So I'm glad I had the opportunity to share this with you guys today, and I hope that this gave you something to think about. Again, if you ever have any questions about public schools, I would be happy to answer those questions. I am the very rare libertarian within the public school systems, and it's because of my time in the public school system that I've moved within libertarianism from classical liberalism to almost a form of anarchism. So I think it's really important to share that story, because anyone that works within a system like that and that reads the kind of books that I do, I think you almost have to draw these conclusions. I hope that this really helps you guys out today. Again, really thankful for you guys listening to the end of this episode. I think that I'm going to be releasing this one as like a special Thursday or Friday episode. So hopefully you enjoyed some extra content this week. And as always, we will be back with a brand new episode on Tuesday. Also, before I let you go over to the Libertarian Christian Institute's website, libertarianchristians.com, and you will find a link to the store there. You can now buy yourself a nice Protestant Libertarian Podcast mug or a nice Protestant Libertarian Podcast coaster. I have both. They're incredibly nice, and they definitely do help the organization and, in turn, this show. So go get you some merch. I think that as we get further into this year, we're going to be looking at getting more and more merchandise out there. I would love to have some t-shirts or stickers or something like that for you guys to get your hands on. So go over to Libertarian Christian Institute, support us, donate, and buy all of our stuff. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see you all on Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.